And it's hard to forget. Sometimes it's hard for people to remember. These were a bunch of kids, lively kids. Just whatever else they were. Yeah.
Your description of the Mondrian, what you saw in the Mondrian, was making me think of the structure of many of the essays, and the idea of using eccentricity as a kind of engine, and the idea of just not distraction, but the adding this new element, this contingency, that then, and I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about the structure and how you see it, how it comes about. Is it an intuitive thing? How much gets redone when you go from a talk piece into a written piece, etc.?
Well, what happens is everybody has, I think, her own or his own idiosyncrasies for how you start something. I always tend to brood about it for a while until something comes to me as problematic, and I look for some fissure through which I can try to enter, and sometimes it takes a little extra hammering away at it to make the fissure large enough to enter. And I'm always even skeptical of my first entry, usually, into it. So what I do is I start to try to make sense of something, sense that is active sense. Like artworks, for me, if they're interesting, have energy. Well, actually, it occurred to me that I have something here that might help explain it. It happens to be on my BlackBerry. It was an email from Martin Esquel, a novelist and poet. I guess you know Martin, don't you?
I know, yes.
Martin asked me a question to which I responded, which kind of gives an idea of like what I think I'm trying to do when I'm answering or trying to respond to something where a question is proposed from someone else or from me. So let me just find you the exchange with Martin. Martin wrote to me asking me about the Wittgenstein essay in the book. And of course I took up Wittgenstein. I was supposedly writing a review of Marjorie Perlow's book, Wittgenstein's Ladder, and I started to do that when I realized that Marjorie had done a very good job of that, but had left out everything about what would constitute Wittgenstein as a poet. What exactly the hell was he doing? Because he certainly wasn't doing philosophy in a straightforward way, even in the back of the Tractatus, or even especially with the Tractatus. So I decided I would take on the whole notion of why I thought of Wittgenstein as a poet, beginning with the seemingly unapproachable Tractatus. And let me just get this. Here it is. It was just a couple of weeks ago that he wrote it to me. David, reading through your piece on Marjorie's book on Wittgenstein, when Wittgenstein says that we can only think logically, I think he means that logic is linguistic. For example, she pulled the rabbit from the cloud would be a logical statement. Is that your understanding of Wittgenstein's sense of logic and imagination? That was Martin's question. Whoops. Let me go down and a little bit. Okay, that was Martin's question, and then came my response. This was no. This line is from the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein was proposing a logical grammar in contradistinction to a conventional grammar for a language whose sentences are all propositions. That is, they're either true or false. It's not our language. In this language, you may say, clouds signify your greener rest, but you can't think it. It is ungrammatical. Now, it seemed to me that Martin had an interesting idea, but it was a little simple for the Wittgenstein. He didn't take the trouble to get a little bit closer to the Wittgenstein to find out enough about it. And I thought I would help clarify it. Martin was generous in his response to my response. He didn't get offended by it. He said, "Oh yes, thanks. It's been a while. And of course that we celebrate is about what we celebrate is how this line, the green arrest, for example, makes one want to absorb, understand, interpret it, while at the same time being unable to think it, which is lovely for its being on the edge of understanding, hovering there, and at the same time putting into a relief understanding and comprehension, at the same time as in the moment of trying to think, understanding and comprehend it, to understand and comprehend it, during which the mind comes to silence. Now Martin's response to me was so much better than his initial question, and sufficiently subtle that I felt very gratified that I had really taken the trouble to respond to him, even though I was afraid he would be offended by my abrupt no, because he suddenly took the point of, like, at the end of the critical discourse that we raised about Wittgenstein, what you really become aware of is the nature of his thinking, and the nature of the limits of his thinking, and the nature of what it leaves you with when you can't think of something, when you can't think something, or the notion that you can't think that green arrest. In the end, it's because the notion of what you mean thinking is limited in certain ways. And Wittgenstein is ready to concede that at all points, but people forget that he's willing to concede that understanding itself is a limited activity. I, for example, have spent a great deal of energy attacking the theory of understanding. What I've said is that people don't understand, in tuning, which is my term for replacement for understanding, I said that we don't understand each other, we tune to each other. And tuning is not the same as understanding. Understanding is an image that is essentially drawn from the notion of elementary plane geometry, the idea of congruence. So we have that our idea is, we come to a situation where our mind has a triangle of a certain shape and configuration and size, which is exactly equivalent to somebody else's luminous triangle of knowledge. And there's no discrepancy between the two. That constitutes total congruence, and that's what the word understanding tends to suggest because of the way it's built. In French, the idiomatic is still there, although it's not quite like that. It's comprendre, which is essentially to enclose. And you suppose that it sort of sits on the boundaries of the closure regarding the arena that is enclosed as what is identical. Now, I believe that this is a mistake, and my whole book, Tuning, was dedicated to arguing that what we do is by going together, we make processes of action that are common actions or actions conducted in common can lead to types of agreement, new types of agreement. And I use two people walking together, a tall man and a small woman, which happens to some degree when I work with Ellie. Well, again, you take these things from wherever they come in your experience, which is another thing I'll be talking about Friday. You know, you're trying to walk with Ellie. Ellie has very short legs compared to mine, which are not so long compared to other people's, and for me to adjust walking at the same speed as she is without going past her, or slowing down and letting her go past me artificially, it's an act of complicated negotiation where she hustles a little bit more and I drag a little bit more, or I try to take shorter steps, and we succeed intermittently. I also suggested that this is probably even more a relationship if you want to describe making love. That in making love you probably have a more amusing version of it, but the point is that the neutral version suits me quite well. But then I ask, is this the same thing as singing together? An improvisational group that sings chorally together would try to seek forms of agreement, chordal agreements that were of some sort acceptable. Now, chordal agreements don't have to be identical. In other words, you can sing a line a fifth above or below, or a third, a fifth or below, or some dissonant amount, like a minor third. A minor third might be acceptable form of agreement, or it might not, depending on the people you're dealing with. So, in other words, an improvisational choral singing thing would be an act of negotiating what constitutes agreement, which I call tuning. And in this sense, I feel that if I set something in motion, I don't expect people to listen to what I say and agree with me. They can try to go with me a certain degree by walking together with me in my pieces to some degree, and get the benefit of like what's there, as Martin suggests, not because we're in total agreement, but because the degree of agreement allows certain images to come out of what you're dealing with. So I think my Mondrian argument, like all other arguments, has problems. All arguments about what an artist is about tend to be incomplete. They have shaggy aspects hanging over the edge and holes in them, but it's a good working attempt to say Mondrian is not a static artist. He's not a high formalist. He's a provocateur. And it opens you to looking at Mondrian again. Now, it's interesting that I look at Mondrian now almost all the time, and I was shocked once by a collector. I went to a show of Alan D'Arcangelo. Alan was an old friend of ours. He had a show, and there was a party thrown for him by one of his collectors. And it was in one of these fancy apartments on the west side of Central Park, big apartment with all sorts of work in it, and every single work was mediocre. It was surprising. It was like astonishing to see the reliability of this guy's choice of artworks was which ones were totally inert. And then I went into the bathroom and I saw the first Mondrian I ever saw that didn't work. And I said, my God, this guy is an absolute genius to be able to find these works that were like that. And there was one work that shook me. It was a great exception. It was a 2-inch square piece of card with a mad drawing on it by Max Ernst. And I realized the reason he got it was it came as a New Year's card or a Christmas card, I don't know which. And he didn't choose it, it chose him. So you see what I think Martin's right, that what happens is I rewrote his line because I didn't feel it was sufficiently ungrammatical. So I introduced the green arrest to get away from the naturalistic. The rabbit taking something out of a cloud is too naturalistic to count as ungrammatical. It's too easy to think it because we have so many dopey cartoons with jackrabbits performing all sorts of things, including brain surgery. We can imagine animals doing anything that human beings can do, often in stupefying ways. But nobody knows what it means to be a green arrest. And no matter what you say about it, it's not going to become logical. So you can't visualize it in the same way. You can't imagine it the way you can imagine a rabbit taking something out of a cloud, which is really easy to imagine. And Wittgenstein's not so much trying to tell you how to imagine things. He's trying to find a way to understand something, to use the term understanding. But what he does is he narrativizes what he's doing. In other words, if Wittgenstein wants to find out what expectation is, he starts telling you a story about waiting for a first date. This guy is coming and he doesn't know whether he smokes or not, so should he lay out cigarettes for him, whatever. And everything is about the slight anxiety of having a first date, which if you don't read it that way, you're losing Wittgenstein. And as I said in the piece, this is an example of a just vernacular, low melodrama version of Schoenberg's Erwartung, which also means expectation. But there it's a disaster on a high expressionist level, and in Wittgenstein it's the embarrassment of a first date. But by enacting the first date anxiety, he kind of gives you a better idea of the meaning of the word in that context, what anticipation, expectation might be. Like when I talk about understanding, I try to get at it. Like I tried to get at understanding because I kept feeling everybody understands too goddamn much. I mean, I always find that when I come to an artwork that's interesting, everybody understands things I don't understand. They're all smarter than I am. They know immediately the answer to questions that I haven't even proposed yet. And then I start proposing the questions, and they're very different from the questions they propose, and the answers are very different. And it all starts from my deliberately concentrating on what I don't understand. If I don't understand something, I know I'm on the right track.